Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So if you were to walk into a bustling commercial district today, with thousands of residents, towering structures, just constant activity, and then you leave for a few years.
Right.
When you come back, the buildings are overgrown with vines, the streets are completely empty. I mean, absolute silence, no sign of where anyone went. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the source material of a historical reality that mirrors that exact scenario in the 17th century St. Lawrence River Valley. We're unpacking a century-long conflict known as the Beaver Wars.
Yeah, or sometimes called the Iroquois Wars, or the French and Iroquois Wars. It is just a profound period to study.
It really is.
Because this conflict completely realigned the tribal geography of North America south of the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
It fundamentally altered the trajectory of European colonial ambitions. And, it represented this enormous demographic and ideological struggle that went way, way beyond mere economic competition.
Right. And for you listening, the goal of this deep dive is to challenge the standard narrative of colonial expansion. We often look at historical maps and see these bold lines denoting European claims stretching endlessly westward, right? As if the continent was just a static checkerboard waiting to be filled.
Which is such a misconception.
Yeah, exactly. By centering indigenous geopolitics and survival strategies, we see a landscape that was entirely fluid, shaped by forces far older and more complex than the decrees of European monarchs. So let's jump right into the geographical and historical starting point of this conflict, which begins with that very mystery of a vanished society.
Yeah, the foundation of this mystery starts in the mid-16th century. The French explorer Jacques Cartier sailed down the St. Lawrence River, specifically in 1534 and then again in 1535.
Right.
And he documented his encounters with a group we now call the St. Lawrence Iroquoians. He described a really thriving, heavily populated region, like he spent time in large fortified villages, most notably Stadacona, which was near present-day Quebec City, and Hochelaga, which was near present-day Montreal.
I want to pause on that term, fortified villages, because I think it's important for understanding the scale of these settlements. We aren't talking about a handful of temporary structures here.
No, not at all. These were substantial permanent towns. I mean, Hochelaga, for instance, was described by Cartier as having 50 large longhouses.
Jeez.
Yeah, surrounded by a triple-tiered wooden palisade for defense. He estimated the population of that single village to be around 1,500 people.
That's a serious settlement.
It really is. And they cultivated vast fields of corn, beans, and squash. Cartier also recorded an ongoing war between the inhabitants of Stadacona and another group he called the Tudumans. So that indicates the region was already this complex theater of alliances and enmities.
But the French didn't stay. I mean, they were distracted by religious wars and political turmoil back in Europe, so they didn't return to establish a permanent colonial presence for over 70 years.
Right, a long gap.
Which brings us to Samuel de Champlain. In 1608, Champlain arrives to found a permanent French settlement at Quebec. He sails down that exact same river, referencing Cartier's old maps and journals, expecting to trade with the inhabitants of Stadacona and Hochelaga.
And he found nothing.
Just nothing.
The villages were entirely gone. The extensive cornfields had just been reclaimed by the forest. The entire St. Lawrence River Valley, which had supported thousands of people just decades prior, was completely uninhabited.
This is the part that is so difficult to comprehend. How does an entire society with fortified towns and deep agricultural roots simply vanish from the map in a span of 70 years? Like, what systemic force could cause that level of sudden, total demographic collapse?
Well, the current consensus among anthropologists and ethnohistorians points directly to the Mohawk. The Mohawk were the easternmost nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also widely known as the Iroquois Confederacy. The archaeological and historical evidence strongly suggests that the Mohawk expanded their territory northward and systematically drove out or destroyed the St. Lawrence Iroquoians.
So they just pushed them out completely.
Yeah. By the time Champlain arrived, that once populated river valley had been turned into a highly contested frontier. It was no longer a place of settlement. It had become a vast hunting ground for the Haudenosaunee and a highly dangerous trade route for northern nations like the Wenda.
Think about the psychological impact of that on the French. Champlain and his men step off their ships into what they perceive as a pristine, untouched wilderness.
Right, a blank slate.
Yeah, they view it as a blank slate for colonization, entirely unaware that they are actually stepping into a freshly depopulated war zone. They're building their colony in the middle of a no man's land.
And that fundamental misunderstanding shaped everything that followed. The disappearance of the St. Lawrence Iroquois created a power vacuum. The northern nations, the Innu, the Algonquin, and the Wendat, they were constantly facing raids from the Haudenosaunee, who were pushing north.
So Champlain walks right into this.
He does. To secure the future of his fragile new colony at Quebec, Champlain realized he needed strong local allies for trade and mutual defense. He was effectively forced to pick sides in a pre-existing indigenous Cold War.
He accepts an invitation to join the Innu, Algonquin, and Wendat alliance against their common enemy, the Haudenosaunee. And this leads us to the specific spark that ignited a century of war. It happens in July 1609.
A huge turning point.
Champlain decides to demonstrate his loyalty to his new indigenous partners in the most direct way possible. He, along with two heavily armed French soldiers, joins an Algonquin and Wendat war party heading south into Mohawk territory.
And Champlain's own writings are very clear about his intent here. He wrote, "I had come with no other intention than to make war."
Wow, okay.
Yeah. They traveled south down the Richelieu River and entered the large body of water that now bears his name, Lake Champlain. On the shores of that lake, they encountered a Mohawk war party, and both sides prepared for a pitched battle the following morning.
Let's drill down into the mechanics of this battle, because the technological clash here it's really profound. When you look at the accounts of that morning, the Mohawk chiefs marched out the front of their lines wearing traditional armor. The sources describe it as arrow-proof body armor made of plated sticks.
Yes, this armor was intricately woven from wood and tough bark, often reinforced with cotton-like plant fibers. It was highly effective against the traditional weapons of the region, stone-tipped or bone-tipped arrows.
So they were well protected against what they were used to.
Exactly. The Mohawk relied on generations of military tradition. Their defensive formations were built around this armor, allowing them to absorb arrow fire and advance steadily toward the enemy. They were confident in their tactical superiority.
And then Champlain steps out from behind the ranks of his allies. He's carrying an arquebus, which is an early, heavy matchlock firearm. For you listening, picture a long, cumbersome weapon where the user has to manually lower a smoldering piece of cord, the match, into a pan of gunpowder to ignite the main charge.
Right. It's not a quick process.
No, not at all. But Champlain levels this weapon, takes aim at the Mohawk chiefs leading the formation, and fires the opening shot.
And that single shot killed two Mohawk chiefs instantly and mortally wounded a third.
Man.
We have to consider the absolute technological shock of that exact second. The deafening noise, the blinding flash of fire, the thick cloud of sulfurous smoke, and the devastating invisible result. The arquebus instantly rendered their traditional plated stick armor completely obsolete.
It just bypassed it entirely.
Yeah, the physical defense they and their ancestors had relied upon for centuries was shattered in a single blast.
It's a terrifying realization. I have to wonder, did Champlain understand the magnitude of what he was doing? Like, did he realize he wasn't just winning a localized skirmish to impress his allies, but fundamentally altering the balance of power on the entire continent?
It's highly doubtful he grasped the long-term consequences. In his mind, he secured a momentary tactical victory and cemented a vital trade alliance. The Mohawk, confronted with a weapon they had never seen and couldn't defend against, broke formation and retreated into the woods.
Wait.
But Champlain had inadvertently triggered an enormous arms race. That single gunshot forced the Haudenosaunee to adapt their entire philosophy of war.
Because they immediately realized that if they continued to fight with stone and wood against lead and gunpowder, they would be annihilated.
That's it. They were pushed into an existential corner. They needed their own sources of European firearms simply to survive. Because Champlain introduced firearms into the conflict and allied the French firmly with their enemies, the Haudenosaunee had to look elsewhere. They had to find a different European power willing to arm them.
Which directs our attention south to the Hudson River Valley and the arrival of the Dutch. Between 1610 and 1614, Dutch navigators began exploring the Hudson River, mapping the region, and establishing a series of seasonal trading posts.
Right.
And this effort culminated in 1624 with the construction of Fort Orange, a permanent settlement located near present-day Albany, New York.
The establishment of Fort Orange presented the Haudenosaunee, specifically the Mohawk, with a critical opportunity. However, they faced an immediate geographic problem. The Mohawk territory was located west of the Hudson River. They were separated from the Dutch trading post by the Mohican people, who controlled the riverbanks and the area immediately surrounding Fort Orange.
And the Mohawk weren't about to let another nation act as middlemen and control their access to the weapons they desperately needed.
No, they absolutely were not. This geographic obstacle led directly to the Mohawk-Mohican War, which raged from 1624 to 1628. The Mohawk launched a sustained campaign against the Mohicans. They ultimately defeated them and drove them east across the Hudson River.
Opening the path.
Exactly. By 1628, the Mohawk had secured direct, unhindered access to Fort Orange and the Dutch traders. Once that direct access was established, the technological balance of power began to shift dramatically.
We really need to contrast the French and Dutch policies regarding firearms because the difference in their approaches dictated the entire course of the ensuing decades. Let's look at the French first. Champlain, having personally demonstrated the destructive power of firearms, became incredibly reluctant to provide them to his indigenous allies.
Right, he saw what they could do.
Yeah, he recognized how destabilizing they were. This hesitation hardened into official French colonial policy. They strictly limited the trade of firearms, offering them only to Wendat leaders who showed a deep, verifiable commitment to Catholicism.
The French viewed the musket not just as a trade good, but as an instrument of social and religious control. The Jesuits were actively trying to convert the Wendat, and the French state used the desperation for firearms as leverage to further that religious mission.
It functions like a rigid corporate licensing agreement with endless, culturally destructive terms and conditions. The French are essentially telling the Wendat, you can have the technology required to survive the changing world, but only if you abandon your traditional spiritual beliefs, restructure your society to align with ours, and prove your absolute loyalty to our God and our King.
That is an incredibly apt comparison.
Yeah.
And we have to consider the deep internal friction this policy caused within Wendat society. You're forcing leaders to make an impossible choice: maintain their cultural identity and face the enemy underarmed, or adopt a foreign religion to secure the survival of their people.
That's brutal.
It created severe structural divisions. You had traditionalist factions and Catholic factions forming within the Wendat Confederacy, weakening their internal cohesion just as their primary enemy was unifying and arming.
Because the Dutch operated under entirely different parameters.
Radically different. The official Dutch West India Company, much like the French, actually had strict regulations against trading firearms to indigenous populations. They wanted to trade metal kettles, axes, awls, and cloth for beaver pelts. But the reality on the ground at Fort Orange was completely divorced from the official regulations in Amsterdam.
Because of the free traders. Oh, right.
Yes. Independent Dutch free traders largely ignored the corporate directives. They operated like unregulated black market arms dealers. They recognized that the Mohawks were willing to pay premium prices in premium beaver pelts for muskets, lead, and gunpowder. The profit margins were simply too high to ignore.
The turning point for this arms trade comes in 1643, and it's tied to another conflict entirely. Down in the lower Hudson Valley, near present-day Manhattan, the Dutch authorities at New Amsterdam engaged in a brutal conflict known as Kief's War against the local Algonquian-speaking tribes.
And Kief's War was a disaster for the Dutch. They found themselves heavily outnumbered and surrounded by hostile forces. To ensure the powerful Mohawk didn't join the Algonquian tribes against them, the Dutch authorities at Fort Orange officially abandoned their restrictions.
They needed the Mohawk on their side.
Or at least neutral, yeah. They needed to ensure Mohawk neutrality or even secure their alliance. As a direct result, they facilitated the mass acquisition of firearms. Historical records indicate that by 1643, the Dutch had provided the Mohawk with roughly 400 muskets.
400 muskets. Let that disparity sink in for a second. If you're putting yourself in the shoes of a Wendat leader in 1643, what's your move here? You have the French parsing out a dozen guns a year to converts, creating internal religious strife in your villages. Meanwhile, your historic enemy, the Mohawk, has just been flooded with 400 European firearms with absolutely no cultural strings attached.
The technological upper hand shifted entirely to the Haudenosaunee. But to understand why they used those weapons the way they did, we have to look at their geographic reality in the early 1640s. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was severely boxed in.
Let's map this out for the listener. They're situated generally south of Lake Ontario and west of the Hudson River in what is now upstate New York.
Correct. To their south were the Susquehannock, a powerful, well-fortified confederacy. To their southwest were the Erie, another populous nation. To their west were the Neutral Confederacy. And to their north and northwest, the Wendat and the Algonquin effectively controlled the Ottawa River and the French trade routes.
blocking them off completely.
Yeah, blocking Haudenosaunee access to the premier fur-bearing territories of the Canadian Shield.
So they are geographically claustrophobic. And to make matters worse, their own local hunting grounds within their territory are becoming severely depleted. The demand for those Dutch muskets, gunpowder, and metal tools requires a constant supply of beaver pelts to trade. They're overhunting their own lands just to maintain their arsenal. They are completely surrounded by populous rivals who control the best hunting grounds and the most lucrative trade routes.
The Haudenosaunee possess the weapons, the strategic need to break out of their isolation, and the necessity to secure new economic resources. Now, the standard historical narrative has long claimed that the Beaver Wars were fought purely over those exhausted beaver pelts.
But the source is still a different story.
Exactly. Modern historiography reveals that the true motives were far deeper, far more complex, and much more existential than a simple trade dispute.
Let's unpack the causes of this conflict. Historical scholarship provides three interlocking theories for why these wars escalated to such an unprecedented level. The first is the economic theory, which was most prominently championed by the historian George T. Hunt in the 1940s.
Right. Hunt's argument is straightforward and aligns with traditional Western economic thought. He argued that the local beaver populations in Haudenosaunee territory were essentially exhausted by the 1630s due to overhunting. To maintain their supply of crucial European goods, not just weapons, but metal cooking pots, iron axes, and woven cloth, they had to find new sources of fur.
Makes sense on the surface.
It does. Hunt posited that they went to war to seize new hunting grounds from their neighbors, control the major transportation routes along the Great Lakes, and establish themselves as the dominant middlemen, forcing the flow of Western pelts to the Dutch at Fort Orange, rather than to the French at Montreal.
But later scholars pushed back hard against this interpretation.
Very hard. Scholars like Bruce Trigger strongly criticized this purely economic theory as being highly Eurocentric. Trigger argued that it reduces the Haudenosaunee to capitalist proxies. It assumes they were driven purely by Western market logic, profit maximization, and supply chain control, and it completely ignores their internal social, cultural, and spiritual motivations.
It assumes they're fighting for profit, rather than fighting for something much more fundamental.
Furthermore, the economic theory fails to align with the actual data from the period. The historian José Antonio Brandel conducted an extensive quantitative analysis of recorded Haudenosaunee raids during this era.
What did he find?
His data clearly shows that their war parties consistently prioritized capturing people, not seizing pelts or securing trade routes. They would often bypass lucrative shipments of furs just to attack a village and take captives.
Which brings us to the second theory, and perhaps the most crucial one for understanding the sheer scale of the violence. The Morning War theory, extensively detailed by historian Daniel Richter. Calling this conflict the Beaver Wars feels like a severe misnomer. Calling it a war over furs is like calling a conflict over national survival a minor trade disagreement.
It really is.
The Haudenosaunee weren't just facing an economic shortage, they were facing an absolute demographic collapse.
The introduction of European diseases to North America was catastrophic. The Haudenosaunee suffered immense population losses, particularly during a severe smallpox epidemic in the 1630s. Some estimates suggest they lost half of their total population in a matter of a few years.
Half? That's just unimaginable.
It is. In Haudenosaunee culture, the death of a family member was not just a personal tragedy. It caused a deep spiritual and social imbalance within the community. The grief was considered a physical force that could destroy the minds of the bereaved if not properly addressed.
And the traditional practice to rectify this imbalance was the mourning war.
Yes. When a person died, especially a prominent person or someone who died violently, the clan mothers who held immense political power in Haudenosaunee society could demand a mourning war. They would call upon the warriors to launch a raid against an enemy group with the specific goal of capturing a living person to replace the deceased.
Let's slow down and really look at the mechanics of this adoption process because it is entirely foreign to the European concept of warfare. A captive is taken during a raid. They're marched back to the Haudenosaunee village. They're often made to run a gauntlet, a physical trial by the village. But then, if they're chosen for adoption by a grieving family, the transformation is absolute.
The captive is formally given the name of the deceased family member. They are given the exact social role, the political responsibilities, and the familial relationships of the dead person. The community is expected to treat them exactly as they treated the person they replaced.
That's fascinating.
The captive is expected to act as that person. It is a profound, literal mechanism for healing the social fabric by filling the empty space left by death.
But consider the math here. When an entire village loses half its population to a disease like smallpox, you can't just launch a small raid to take one or two captives. You need to absorb thousands of people just to maintain the viability of your society.
And that creates a devastating, inescapable cycle. The cycle of the Morning War becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of endless violence. You launch a large-scale war to secure hundreds of captives to replace the population lost to disease, but large-scale warfare inevitably leads to more of your own warriors dying in combat.
Right, which causes more grief.
Exactly. Those new combat deaths create new waves of grief, which require the clan mothers to demand even more mourning wars to secure more captives. It is a perpetual motion machine of conflict driven by grief and survival.
The economic demand for furs provides the firearms necessary to fight. The demographic crisis from smallpox provides the desperate need to capture people. And the third theory, the ideological theory proposed by Francis Jennings, provides the overarching framework for how they justified and organized this vast expansion. This centers on the Great Law of Peace.
The Great Law of Peace is the oral constitution that governed the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It was established centuries prior by the peacemaker in Hiawatha. Its primary goal was to end the endemic cycle of blood feuds and internal conflict among the five founding nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, by uniting them under a single political structure. This union was symbolized as a large communal longhouse.
So the Great Law wasn't just a peace treaty, it was a functioning political union.
Right. Jennings argued that the Haudenosaunee viewed neighboring Iroquoian-speaking groups, such as the Wendat, the Neutral, and the Erie, not just as enemies but as wayward relatives. Because these groups shared similar languages and cultural roots, the Haudenosaunee felt they should logically be part of the Confederacy.
Oh, I see.
When these nations refused to join the Union peacefully, the Haudenosaunee felt justified in using force. The goal of the warfare was not necessarily extermination, but to force the political submission and eventual absorption of these related peoples. It was an ideological mission to, as they phrased it, extend the rafters of the Longhouse.
It's like an expanding empire enforcing a constitution at gunpoint. So you synthesize these three powerful historical forces. The economic necessity to trade with Europeans provides the cutting-edge weaponry. The demographic freefall from disease provides the absolute desperate need for human beings. And the Great Law provides the ideological justification to absorb entire neighboring nations.
A perfect storm.
Yeah. With these factors perfectly aligned, the newly armed Haudenosaunee launched an unprecedented offensive that would completely shatter their neighbors.
The escalation was incredibly rapid, and it began with a failure of diplomacy. In 1641, a delegation of Mohawk diplomats traveled to the French settlement of Trois-Rivières. They proposed a formal peace treaty with the French.
Okay, that sounds promising.
It does, but the French governor, Charles de Montmagny, rejected the proposal. The Mohawk condition for peace was that the French must abandon their alliance with the Wendat. Montmagny refused to betray his primary trading partners, so the war continued.
But a few years later, in 1645, diplomacy seemed to finally work. The French and the Iroquois successfully negotiated a peace treaty. As part of this agreement, the French formally granted the Iroquois the right to trade their furs directly at French settlements. It looked like the tensions might ease.
It did, but it was shattered the very next year by a profound betrayal. In the summer of 1646, the Iroquois arrived at the French settlements with a large fleet of 80 canoes, heavily laden with a harvest of prime furs, expecting to trade as agreed in the treaty.
And the French backed out.
They did. The French authorities balked. They refused to buy the furs directly from the Iroquois, telling them they had to use the Wendat as middlemen.
The French reneged on the core term of the peace treaty. The Iroquois must have been completely outraged. They had tried diplomacy, they had tried peaceful trade. They were rebuffed and humiliated by the French. They returned home, resumed the war, and this time, the scale of the violence was entirely different.
In 1648, the Dutch at Fort Orange made a fateful decision. They officially authorized the direct sale of guns to the Mohawks in large quantities. Armed with over 400 new muskets, ample gunpowder, and an insatiable need for captives, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy mobilized. They sent a coordinated force of roughly 1,000 warriors deep into the heart of Wendat territory near the shores of Georgian Bay.
And crucially, they did it at the onset of winter. I am struggling to wrap my head around the logistics of a winter attack of this magnitude. Moving 1,000 men through the wilderness is difficult enough in the summer, but winter in that region is brutal. How are they feeding an army that size? How are they surviving the freezing temperatures?
The strategic brilliance and the sheer physical endurance required for a winter attack cannot be overstated. Winter was a time traditionally universally avoided for large-scale warfare in the Great Lakes region.
Because it's practically impossible.
Exactly. Food is incredibly scarce, meaning an army has to carry its provisions. Travel through deep snow requires snowshoes and exhausts immense calories. The lack of foliage means there's no natural cover from the freezing winds. Indigenous communities typically hunker down in their fortified villages, relying on stored food and waiting for the spring thaw.
So they felt completely safe. They weren't expecting an attack because an attack was considered logistically impossible.
Spot on. By striking in the dead of winter, the Haudenosaunee achieved complete and absolute tactical surprise. They marched hundreds of miles through the frozen landscape and descended upon the Wendat settlements.
Picture the absolute terror of that winter raid in 1648. The deep, heavy silence of the snowbound forest is suddenly broken by the blast of hundreds of muskets. 1,000 heavily armed warriors breached the palisades of the major Wendat towns. It completely shattered the geopolitical balance of the region in a single devastating season.
The destruction was unparalleled.
The attack destroyed key villages, killed countless warriors who were unprepared for a siege, and resulted in the taking of thousands of captives. The Wendat Confederacy, which had a robust population of 25,000 to 30,000 people, was utterly dispersed.
The societal collapse of the Wendat was immediate and total. The survivors burned their own remaining villages so the Haudenosaunee couldn't use them, and they fled in all directions. Some sought refuge to the east with the French Jesuits at Quebec. Many thousands were captured and assimilated into the Haudenosaunee.
Right.
Others fled west and joined the Petun Nation, eventually amalgamating over decades to become the Wyandot people. It was the complete, violent dismantling of a major regional power.
The historical records also mention the deaths of several French Jesuit missionaries during these attacks: Jean de Brebeuf, Charles Garnier, and Gabriel Lallemant. They were tortured and killed and are considered martyrs of the Catholic Church.
They are.
But beyond the immediate violence of the raids, I keep coming back to the logistical nightmare of the aftermath. What the Haudenosaunee were attempting is staggering. How does a society effectively digest and integrate an influx of captives that rivals or even exceeds its own original population?
It creates an incredible, almost unbearable strain on the social and political fabric of the Confederacy. The Haudenosaunee were so successful in their campaigns that they took more captives than they could cleanly and effectively assimilate. While the ritual of adoption was powerful, you cannot easily erase the identity of thousands of traumatized adults who vividly remember their old lives.
It must have led to deep internal fractures.
It absolutely did. By the 1660s, some Haudenosaunee villages were actually majority captive. You had Mohawk towns where more people spoke Algonquian or Wendat than the Mohawk language. This led to severe factions within the Confederacy.
I can imagine.
Furthermore, many of these Wendat captives had previously converted to Catholicism and retained their Christian beliefs even after being adopted. Over time, large divisions of these Catholic-aligned adopted peoples migrated north, away from the Haudenosaunee heartland, to establish new settlements near Montreal to live closer to the French priests. In a deeply ironic twist, the Haudenosaunee accidentally bolstered the population of their French enemies through their total destruction of the Wendat.
And their campaigns didn't stop with the dispersal of the Wendat. The momentum of their newly militarized society pushed them onward. Following the destruction of the Wendat in 1649, they turned their attention westward to the neutral nation. In a brief, brutal campaign from 1650 to 1651, they drove the neutral completely from their traditional territory around the Niagara Peninsula.
Then they pivoted southwest. They launched an enormous invasion against the Erie Confederacy, a war that lasted from 1654 to 1656. The Erie were renowned warriors, and they utilized poisoned arrows, but they lacked firearms. The Haudenosaunee, utilizing their Dutch muskets and extensive siege tactics, systematically destroyed the Erie towns.
It's remarkable because the Haudenosaunee were often greatly outnumbered by the confederacies they were attacking. The Wendat, the Neutral, the Erie, these were not small tribes, they were large, populous nations.
Right, they had the numbers.
But the Haudenosaunee achieved decisive, annihilating victories through their concentrated use of firearms, their unified political will under the Great Law, and highly coordinated military planning. By the late 1650s, they had effectively cleared their northern, western, and southwestern borders, creating a vast perimeter of depopulated territory around their homeland.
Having systematically removed the indigenous buffer states that surrounded them, The Haudenosaunee turned their full attention to the architects of their original isolation, the French colony of New France. This shift initiates a distinctly different phase of the conflict, characterized by a style of warfare the French called the Petite Guerre.
The Haudenosaunee shifted from attacking large indigenous confederacies to attacking the colonial infrastructure of New France directly. They besieged the primary French settlements along the St. Lawrence River, Ville-Marie, which is present-day Montreal, Trois-Rivières, and Quebec itself.
But we need to define what a siege looked like in this context. The Petite Guerre was not a formal European-style siege. The Haudenosaunee didn't build trench lines or bring up heavy artillery to batter down the stone and wood walls of the French forts. They understood that assaulting fortified positions directly would result in unacceptable casualties.
So it operates much more like a modern insurgency.
Precisely. They didn't aim to conquer the walled cities, they aimed to strangle them. Haudenosaunee war parties, ranging from a dozen men to several hundred, would infiltrate the forests surrounding the French settlements. They made the territory outside the defensive walls so incredibly dangerous that the colonial economy and daily life simply ground to a halt.
I imagine farmers were terrified to leave the fort to tend their fields. Traders couldn't move goods down the river without being ambushed. If you stepped outside the palisade to chop wood for the winter fires, you risked being captured or killed by an unseen enemy in the tree line.
The psychological toll on the French colonists was immense. They lived in a state of perpetual terror. For decades, they were essentially trapped within their small fortresses, watching their colony slowly starve. We see the desperation of this era illustrated in the famous 1660 Battle of Long Sault.
What happened there?
A French force, led by Adam Doller des Ormeaux, along with Huron and Algonquin allies, moved up the Ottawa River to intercept a Haudenosaunee raiding party. They were surrounded and fought to the death in a small, dilapidated fort. While often mythologized in later French-Canadian folklore as a heroic stand that saved Montreal from destruction, it practically highlights the desperate, defensive posture the French were forced into. They were fighting for bare survival.
The situation in New France became so dire that the French crown in Paris finally realized the colony was on the verge of complete collapse. They had to take direct action. In the mid-1660s, King Louis XIV ordered significant structural changes. The crown took direct control of the colony from the private trading companies. And most importantly, they sent military reinforcements, the Carignan-Sierre Regiment.
This was a pivotal moment. The regiment consisted of roughly 1,000 uniformed, heavily armed, regular troops from France. This was the first deployment of professional European soldiers in Canada. Furthermore, the government of New France finally authorized the widespread, direct sale of arms to their remaining Indian allies, attempting to match the Haudenosaunee's firepower and push back.
But the French transition from a huddled defense to an active offense was rocky, to say the least. It demonstrated how profoundly unprepared European armies were for North American warfare. In January 1666, the French governor, Daniel de Remy de Courcelles, attempted to mimic the Haudenosaunee tactical brilliance by launching a winter invasion of the Mohawk homeland.
It was a disastrous expedition. Courcelles led a force of 400 to 500 men south into the wilderness. But these were regular French soldiers. They were trained for open field combat in the temperate climates of Europe. They marched into an upstate New York winter wearing standard uniforms, lacking adequate snowshoes, and carrying heavy European-style provisions.
You can vividly envision the misery of that march. Hundreds of European soldiers struggling through waist-deep snow, freezing in the sub-zero temperatures, completely exhausted, while Mohawk scouts effortlessly track them invisibly through the trees, picking off stragglers.
The elements defeated them before they ever fired a shot. They suffered heavily from frostbite, hypothermia, and starvation. Courcelles was forced to order a humiliating retreat before they even reached the first Mohawk village. It was a profound failure of logistics and environmental adaptation.
But the French learned from their mistake, didn't they?
They did. They tried again later that year, and this time they changed their strategy entirely.
In September 1666, Alexander de Pourville de Tracy led a much larger, better prepared force of about 1,300 men. They timed the expedition for the autumn, avoiding the deep snow. They reached the Mohawk villages in mid-October.
But when Tracy's vast army arrived, they found the villages empty. The Mohawk, utilizing their extensive scouting network, saw the overwhelming size of the French force and wisely chose not to engage in a pitched battle against professional infantry. They hastily abandoned their settlements and retreated into the deep forest. Tracy didn't have an enemy army to fight, so he executed a devastating scorch earth strategy.
He targeted the infrastructure of their survival. He ordered the large, permanent longhouses burned to the ground. And crucially, because it was mid-October, the Mohawks' extensive fields of corn, beans, and squash were ready for the winter harvest. Tracy's troops spent days systematically destroying all the crops and burning the stored food reserves.
He shifted the warfare from direct combat to forced starvation. By destroying the entire food supply just weeks before the harsh winter set in, he inflicted massive, indiscriminate damage on the Mohawk population. Women, children, and the elderly were left to face the freezing temperatures with no shelter and no food. This brutal, total war tactic broke their immediate capacity to fight. The suffering was so severe that it forced the Mohawk, and shortly after the Oneida, to agree to a formal peace settlement with the French in July 1667.
But it's vital to understand that the 1667 peace treaty with the French did not signal the end of the Beaver Wars. Not by a long shot. It simply freed the Haudenosaunee from the burden of fighting a two-front war. With their northern and eastern borders secured by the treaty, they could redirect their military expansion further west and further south.
This westward expansion is a fascinating era because of the profound domino effect it caused across the entire North American continent. The Haudenosaunee pushed deep into the Ohio country and the Illinois country, vast territories west of the Appalachian Mountains. They displaced numerous established nations, such as the Shawnee, forcing them to flee westward into the territory of the Miami Confederacy.
They are essentially pushing a wave of refugees ahead of their advance, destabilizing regions hundreds of miles from their homeland.
The cascading effects were monumental. Perhaps the most profound butterfly effect of this entire century of conflict is what happened to groups living on the western edges of the Great Lakes, like the Lakota.
How so?
The intense geopolitical pressure exerted by the Haudenosaunee advance pushed these eastern tribes further west, which in turn pushed the Lakota out of the woodlands, across the Mississippi River, and onto the open plains. There, in that new environment, they eventually encountered European horses moving up from the Spanish Southwest. They adopted the horse culture, abandoned their previous agricultural practices, and embraced the nomadic bison hunting lifestyle that would make them the iconic Plains Indians of the 18th and 19th centuries.
That is an incredible historical connection to make. The enduring image of the nomadic, horse-riding plains warrior, a staple of global historical consciousness, is directly, causally tied to the geopolitical pressure exerted by a Haudenosaunee war party armed with Dutch muskets 1,000 miles away.
It perfectly illustrates how fluid and interconnected the continent was. And as the Haudenosaunee operated further and further from their home territory in New York, their supply lines stretched thin, forcing them to continue innovating their tactics. They couldn't rely on overwhelming numbers in the Deep West. The historical sources describe them developing highly specialized amphibious guerrilla warfare. They would travel vast distances via the river networks by canoe, moving exclusively at night to maintain absolute stealth.
And their method of hiding their approach is brilliant. To ensure their canoes weren't spotted on the riverbanks by enemy scouts, they would paddle near their target, fill their birch bark canoes with heavy river stones, and deliberately sink them to the shallow bottom of the riverbed.
The mechanics of this require immense discipline and coordination. You have to mark the location precisely in the dark. Once the canoes are submerged, the war party moves silently through the woods, executes a sudden, devastating raid on an enemy village at dawn, takes captives, and retreats rapidly back to the river.
Then what? They just pull them up.
Exactly. They pull the stones from the canoes, raise them to the surface, and vanish down the river before the surviving enemies can organize any form of pursuit or resistance.
Try to picture that scene. Warriors silently sinking rock-filled canoes in a moonlit river, disappearing into the dark tree line to strike, and then vanishing back down the river like ghosts before the sun fully rises. It is masterful, terrifying warfare. But they weren't invincible. As they pushed further west, they eventually encountered nations capable of halting their advance. The Anishinaabe Confederacy, utilizing the newly acquired firearms that the French were now actively supplying to Western tribes, managed to strike back.
Yes, near present-day South Bend, Indiana, the Anishinaabe laid a sophisticated ambush. They utilized their knowledge of the local terrain and their new firepower to surround and destroy a large, overconfident Iroquois war party. This defeat marked the western limit of Haudenosaunee expansion.
This raises a vital question regarding the overarching Haudenosaunee strategy. Did they fundamentally overextend themselves? They conquered vast, sprawling tracts of land in the Ohio and Illinois country, defeating numerous tribes. But they simply didn't have the population density to colonize those lands. They created a massive, depopulated buffer zone, an empty hunting ground, rather than a true, settled empire.
That is an accurate assessment. Their control over the western regions was ultimately brief and tenuous because they couldn't establish a permanent demographic presence to hold the territory. Furthermore, they were stretched thin because, while expanding west, they were simultaneously fighting a major, protracted war to their south against the Susquehannock.
And the Susquehannock were formidable opponents. They were culturally and linguistically similar to the Haudenosaunee, and they were well armed, having established a strong alliance with the English colony of Maryland. In 1663, they demonstrated their power by surviving a massive siege by a combined force of 800 Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga warriors. They were holding their ground against the full weight of the Haudenosaunee western door.
They held their ground militarily, but they were ultimately undone by shifting colonial politics. For years, their alliance with Maryland provided them with the weapons and support necessary to resist the Iroquois. But in 1674, the political landscape shifted beneath them. Maryland decided it was more advantageous to align with the dominant regional power. They changed their Indian policy, negotiated a separate peace with the Iroquois, and abruptly terminated their alliance with the Susquehannock.
Leaving them completely vulnerable.
Right. Suddenly isolated, cut off from their supply of firearms, the Susquehannock suffered a rapid series of major defeats by the Haudenosaunee.
The end of the Susquehannock as a sovereign power is particularly grim and highlights the treachery of the era. In 1675, amidst the chaos of Bacon's rebellion, colonial militias from Virginia and Maryland actually besieged a Susquehannock fort. During the siege, they invited the Susquehannock chiefs out for a parley, a diplomatic meeting under a flag of truce. And then, in clear violation of the rules of war, the militia assassinated the chiefs. The survivors of that betrayal were eventually scattered, with many being forced north to be absorbed by their conquerors, the Iroquois.
While the Haudenosaunee were fighting these exhaustive wars in the west and south, the geopolitical map of the eastern seaboard shifted yet again. The English fleet seized the colony of New Netherland from the Dutch in 1664, renaming it New York. The English eventually took over the vital role of supplying the Haudenosaunee with firearms from Fort Orange, which they renamed Albany.
So the English are their main suppliers now.
Yes. Concurrently, the French, seeing the Haudenosaunee distracted by southern wars, decided to aggressively re-enter the western fur trade. This direct French expansion into the Great Lakes threatened the Haudenosaunee monopoly and inevitably broke the fragile peace established back in 1667.
This brings us to the resumption of hostilities in the 1680s and the bloody road back to Montreal. Before we detail the campaigns, address the human element here for a moment. The sheer endurance required by all parties is staggering. For you listening, think about what it means for a society to exist in a state of total war for almost 100 continuous years. We are talking about multiple generations of indigenous peoples and European colonists who lived and died knowing nothing but constant conflict, the threat of raids, and the imperative to capture or be captured.
It creates a deeply militarized, traumatized society where warfare is inextricably intertwined with daily survival, economic function, and cultural identity. The psychological toll of living under the constant threat of a dawn raid, of losing family members repeatedly, fundamentally hardens a society. When the war with France renewed in the 1680s, it was characterized by a bitter, exhaustive brutality.
How did it kick off again?
The French explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, began extensively arming the western Algonquin tribes in 1681, specifically to protect the expanding French fur trade. This policy directly undermined the Haudenosaunee hard-won dominance in the region.
The conflict quickly escalated to a new low regarding the treatment of prisoners, driven by the actions of the newly appointed French governor, the Marquis de Denonville. In 1687, Denonville lured a group of Iroquois diplomats and warriors into a meeting under the pretense of a peace conference. He captured 58 Iroquois men, but he didn't execute them, and he didn't hold them for standard diplomatic ransom.
What he did was unheard of.
He loaded 36 of these captive men onto ships and sent them across the Atlantic Ocean to serve as galley slaves in Marseille, France.
Sending captives to be chained to the oars of French naval galleys in the Mediterranean Sea violated every conceivable cultural rule of warfare the Haudenosaunee held. In a culture centered profoundly on the mourning war, where a captive is either adopted to replace a lost life or ritually executed, Permanently removing people from the continent to serve as chattel slaves across the ocean was an unfathomable, unforgivable offense.
It crossed every line.
It was a desecration of their spiritual framework. It guaranteed an absolute, unified, and uncompromising retaliation from the Confederacy.
It's a surreal and deeply tragic collision of world's Haudenosaunee warriors from the forests of New York, chained to oars, rowing French galleys in the Mediterranean sun. And the Haudenosaunee retaliation for this betrayal was swift and devastating. On the morning of August 4, 1689, a huge force of roughly 1,500 Iroquois warriors bypassed the French military forts and descended upon the civilian settlement of Lachine, located just outside Montreal. They burned the village to the ground, killed dozens of colonists, and took dozens more captive.
This specific period of the Beaver Wars aligns with the larger global conflict known as King William's War, which pitted France against England. The European rivalries poured gasoline onto the indigenous conflicts. The French, alongside their Indian allies, launched brutal winter raids against English colonial settlements, as the English were now firmly allied with the Iroquois.
Right.
This led to horrific events like the Schenectady Massacre in New York in 1690. The violence escalated into a grueling, decade-long series of raids and counter-raids throughout the 1690s, with large French armies penetrating deep into Iroquois territory to systematically burn their remaining villages and crops, while the Iroquois continually harassed the borders of New France.
It becomes a war of attrition.
Yeah.
After 50 years of nearly constant grinding warfare since the destruction of the Wendat, a combination of sheer physical exhaustion, shifting colonial threats, and mutual economic necessity finally forced all parties to the negotiating table. The English colonies along the coast were growing rapidly in population and power, and Haudenosaunee leaders began to view English expansion as a far greater long-term threat to their southern borders than the weakened French to their north.
The French, too, were exhausted and realized their century of military policies had fundamentally failed. After decades of bloodshed, immense financial cost, and the repeated near destruction of their colony, French administrators concluded that securing peace and befriending the Haudenosaunee was the only viable, cost-effective way to secure the northern fur trade and protect their borders.
This mutual exhaustion leads to the monumental Great Peace of Montreal in the summer of 1701. Visualize the scene of this treaty signing. It's not just two men at a table. You have 39 different First Nations chiefs representing diverse tribes from across the continent, many of whom had been locked in bitter existential warfare against each other for decades, gathering in one place alongside the French colonial leadership to redraw the geopolitical lines of North America.
It was an unparalleled diplomatic achievement. In the treaty, the Haudenosaunee agreed to stop their military campaigns westward and remain neutral in future conflicts between the French and the English. Crucially, this peace allowed the displaced Western tribes, the Shawnee, Miami, Potawatomi, and Illinois, to finally return to their ancestral homelands in the Ohio Valley without fear of Iroquois raids. It established a relatively stable regional peace that lasted well into the 1720s.
Looking back at the long shadow of this conflict, I have to ask you to evaluate New France's overall project here. Champlain started this entire endeavor in 1608, wanting to secure a peaceful, highly profitable trading colony. Did the French, after a century of effort, achieve their goals?
Ultimately, the New France colonial project was far less profitable and infinitely more violent than Champlain ever envisioned. Their initial, seemingly small decision to involve themselves in local indigenous trade networks entangled them in complex generational alliances that destroyed the region's stability. By introducing advanced weapons and acting as a vector for devastating disease, French policies actively exacerbated a century of unprecedented warfare that nearly resulted in their own eradication.
And the geopolitical echoes of the Beaver Wars lasted for generations long after the peace treaty. The territorial claims established by Haudenosaunee conquest became points of legal contention for centuries. In 1768, the Indiana Land Company tried to legally claim vast western territories, arguing their title was valid based on the Iroquois right of conquest established during the Beaver Wars.
The echoes just kept going.
Yeah, decades later, during the American Revolutionary War, the prominent Mohawk chief Joseph Brant led Haudenosaunee forces in a firm alliance with the British, desperately hoping to use British power to stop American colonial encroachment onto those same lands. After the British lost the war, many Haudenosaunee were forced to leave their ancestral homes in New York and relocate to Canada. Furthermore, the Western tribes the Haudenosaunee had fought and displaced for a century were eventually worn down and forced to cede their homelands to the newly formed United States in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville.
The subsequent history of the entire Great Lakes region and the Ohio Valley was fundamentally shaped by the borders violently forged and the alliances desperately broken during the Beaver Wars.
Which brings us to a final, deeply complex historical paradox to ponder based on modern scholarship of the era. Scholars today actively debate whether the brutal campaigns of the Beaver Wars should be legally and historically classified as an act of genocide.
It's a profound and difficult debate within the field of genocide studies. When you look at the sheer brutality of the campaigns and the complete deliberate dispersal of entire nations like the Wendat, the Neutral, and the Erie, it looks on the surface like a systematic campaign of extermination. However, as we discussed extensively, the Haudenosaunee's primary driving goal was mass adoption via the Morning War. They were literally attempting to make their enemies into their own people to replenish their dying population.
And that reality challenges the traditional legal requirement of the intent to destroy a people, which is the cornerstone of the United Nations definition of genocide. If the ultimate overriding goal of the violence is to integrate the survivors as a full, equal members of your own society, to give them the names and roles of your own family members, it doesn't fit the strict biological definition of genocide. The destruction of the Wendat was the complete political destruction of a sovereign entity, but it was not the biological eradication of its people.
It is a paradox that forces us to critically reconsider the strict, modern categories we use to define historical atrocities. How do we accurately categorize a war where the ultimate goal is not to eradicate the enemy, but to absorb them entirely so that your own society might survive?
It brings us right back to those historical maps we discussed at the beginning. We instinctively look for clean borders, simple narratives of conquest, and clear distinctions between victory and defeat. But the reality on the ground is always far more complex. It's driven by raw forces of demographic survival, complex spiritual ideologies, and desperate adaptation that defy simple categorization. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.